I'm very fortunate to be here with Irwin Turbitt, who is going to be one of our guest speakers on the Leading Community Change programme for the Leicestershire and Rutland Community Leadership Programme. We're going to be having a conversation about leading change and leading complex change, and we will then be joined by Irwin in a couple of weeks' time in one of our modules. So thank you so much, Irwin, for joining us today. Welcome to our conversation, and thank you for agreeing to answer some questions so that everybody can get to know you a bit before our session.
Brilliant.
So, sorry.
I was just going to say, it's good to see you, Debbie. We've known each other for a while now. It's good to be working with you, and the work that you're doing with the people on the program is not only interesting work, but it's very important work. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be involved in it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You know, you'll meet the leaders themselves. They're the ones doing the work on the front line. Okay, let's get into it then. I know you have been spending a lot of your life's work in and around the field of being a leader, and in particular adaptive leadership. And what the community leaders are doing is definitely in this field. They are leading local programs with the overall aim of preventing violence or the impact of violence, and in particular knife crime, on their local communities. And that's a tough job. And I know that in your experience, you've had some tough jobs as well over your lifetime and career. From the perspective of leading change in complex, tricky social situations, where would you start as a leader?
Well, there's one big advantage of working on something that is as complex as violent crime, and that is that you can start anywhere. So we tend to think when we're working on a problem that we need to understand the problem, and then we need to figure out what good looks like, and then we need to figure out where we are, and then we need to start from where we are and work in a pretty straight line, week by week, month by month, year by year, towards where we want to be. Now, the problem with that approach to change or problem solving or improvement is it's not based in the circumstances in which we find ourselves working. It was designed to work in a factory. It was designed by Henry Ford, a guy called Frederick Winslow Taylor, people like Duran. It was designed to help Ford and then Toyota and just about everybody make motor cars. And the fundamental difference between the work of violence reduction and making motor cars is that motor car manufacture happens inside a factory. It doesn't happen outside in the environment. If it's raining, it doesn't matter. If it's a warm day, it doesn't matter. Whatever's happening outside the factory doesn't impact what happens inside the factory. Generally, exceptions, of course, Brexit. But Brexit comes along once in a generation. It doesn't happen every day. Whereas, as someone who has experience in policing public disorder, of course, the most important thing that will determine the outcome is not the quality of the police operation, not the motivation of the people to be peaceful or to be violent, it's the weather. Even very violent people find it really hard to riot if it's raining very heavily. And so that's the first thing that's really, I think, important to grasp. To get more directly to your question, essentially you can start anywhere. This is the great advantage of this type of work. You need to go everywhere, but you can start anywhere. And so where do you start? Well, I like to say to people, it's very simple. Reach out your arm, and whatever you touch or whoever you touch, that's the place to start. And it's probably better to start with people than the actual problem, because it's going to be through working in a generative set of relationships with people that you will make progress on the problem. Notice I didn't say you'd solve the problem. I mean, I'd like you to be ambitious. I want you to be ambitious. But the idea that you will eliminate violent crime, even in Leicester, is just not going to happen. I worked on a violent crime reduction program when I worked in the Home Office, and we reduced violent crime across England and Wales by 14%, which is 156,000 less victims of violent crime. But of course, some of those people will have become victims later because, in a sense, you can't eliminate violent crime. So you might prevent someone being a victim today. That doesn't mean they won't be a victim tomorrow or next year or in 10 years. And so, again, we need to think differently. This is what adaptive work's about. It's about thinking and acting differently from the way that many of us have either read about or been taught or have tried to solve problems using the approach that works in car factories. You know this doesn't work if you ring a call center, don't you? I mean, we've all had that experience of being processed through a call center as if we were a part in a car factory. It's unbelievably frustrating. What we want is someone who will engage with us as a person. And so it's that engagement of people with each other. So I would say find a friend would be the first thing, and then find a freak, someone who's not a friend, someone who's different, someone who sees the world differently to you, maybe even radically different to you, and maybe even someone who's very much against you and would argue with you a lot. You might consider them to be in conflict with you, which, as long as it's not physical, is actually very productive. The great thing about arguing with somebody is you know that they're engaged. Now, they may not be engaged positively, but they're engaged. The worst thing is trying to work with people who pretend to be engaged because they agree. Yes, oh, yes. Yeah, no, that's great. Oh, very good. Yeah, yeah. But they have no intention of working with you at all. They're, in some senses, just pretending. The person who's angry with you and is arguing with you is probably not pretending, and they have energy for the subject. So, very keen that people look for a friend and then look for a freak. And that's a very good way, in my experience, of getting started.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Um, and so, in talking about what it is that you want to change as a leader and why you want to change, I mean, we know that, you know, effective leaders have a strong vision and have a sense of purpose, and they're able to bring people along with them. It sounds like what you're advocating there is find people who also agree with your vision, or they're vaguely aligned to your vision. They recognize and appreciate your purpose, but also people who disagree. Or have got a different angle on it. You know, it's the same subject area. It's something they might be engaged in. They could be themselves engaged in criminal activity, in you know, being affected by violent crime, but have a different view to you as to what it is that would reduce it or prevent it, or as you say, not eliminate it, but reduce it or prevent it, or channel it in a different direction. But they're passionate about it, whatever it is.
Yes, exactly. Engagement rather than agreement. I mean, we want to work towards agreement, but too often we start looking for people who agree. Engagement is more important than agreement initially. Remember, we're talking about how you get started. You don't want to work for 5 years with someone who you never agree with about anything. But equally, working for 5 years with someone who agrees with everything you say but does nothing in support of it is also very, very frustrating and not at all generative.
Oh, oh, okay, thank you. So, would you would you call? I mean, obviously, right now we're in February 21. We're at the we're somewhere near the end, perhaps. Fingers crossed, of being locked up due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's certainly light at the end of the tunnel. Would you be calling groups together? Would you be, putting yourself out there in community centres, in football clubs, in development centre settings, to almost have public meetings, to start a movement somewhere?
Yeah, well, that is one way of starting a movement. But another way of starting a movement is with your friends and your freaks, and people who you can get some level of engagement with. And I am quite attracted to a sort of concentric circle idea. So imagine a dartboard, and there's two types of divisions on a dartboard. There is the segment, the triangular shaped bit, but then there are circles. So both of these are important. So if you think about a pizza, it's made up of a number of slices, and think about each of those slices or sections as a faction, a group of people like you. And if you're at the center of the dartboard, the little bit at the middle where they come together in a point, then people behind you from your faction are, the further out you go, the less engaged they are. Okay. But then immediately opposite you, at the center of that, is the leader of another faction. Now, they may be directly opposing you, and very often we think that's a good place to start. Well, it's a very difficult place to start because you're starting at the most difficult place. But if you think about the faction either side of you, yeah, there are people to your left and right. They're not opposing you, but they're beside you. And so that's where I would start looking for some friends. And then if there are, just to give you an example, three of you here, pretty close to each other, roughly on this side of the argument, the debate, the problem, behind each of you, there are a lot of other people. And I want to start thinking actually about who those people are and start categorizing those people. And there is a way of doing this, um, which is based on an approach to, it's called the law of diffusion of innovation. It's essentially about how technology products spread in a market. But the pattern is very helpful here. So at one end of the spectrum, you have got the innovators. These are the people, probably the people on the program. These are the people who care enough about something to get up and do something. They have moved beyond that wonderful habit we have in this fine country of ours of grumbling about something. So we're not just stood around somewhere, either virtually or physically, grumbling and saying they should do something about this. We've actually decided we will do something about this. I will do something about this. We will do something about this. So in some sense, they're the innovators. The problem is they're quite scary to normal people because normal people are not as willing or able to do that. And so we need to get from the innovators, the people on your program, to the normal people, because that's where the bulk of people are. And I'm using the word normally here, or the word normal, technically, statistically. I don't mean in the way we often use it in language as I'm normal, you're abnormal. I don't mean that. I mean, most people are normal, whatever it is. If you live in a criminal community, most people in the community will be criminals. Of course, that's not what we mean by a criminal community, because even in what we might label a criminal community, most people will not be criminals. So there's a number of, as we go out in these circles, if you like, at the center, we've got the innovators. Then we've got what you might call the fast followers or the early adopters. These are the people that you're probably already meeting with, talking to, maybe working with a little bit off and on occasionally, but not all of the time. And then the big jump is to what's called the early majority. Numerically, this is 34% of your population. So 5% innovators, 10% early adopters, then you're into 34% are the early majority. The next 34% are the late majority. They are in some ways the most useful people because you never have to do anything with them. They are just followers. So what everybody else is doing, they will do too. Yeah. And then lastly, you've got 15% who are the, whatever you want to call them, I sometimes like to refer to these people as dementors. So if you think about, those creatures in the Harry Potter novels, they're these sort of spirit creatures, but they're very dark. And before you even see them, you can feel them. It's like they suck the energy, the passion, the enthusiasm from you. And then you look up and you go, John, I felt you coming. So you want to stay away from those people. You might get to them at some stage, but that would be in a perfect world. But notice if we never get to them, we've got 85% of the population, 5% people like you on the program, the next 10% of people that you probably already know, the next 35% that I'm going to talk about how we get to them, the 35% that follow what everyone else is doing, and the 15% that, yeah, maybe, but 85% will do very well for me, actually. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
that's your concentric circles. So if you find people who are like you, who are, in the same position of you in other factions, I can't really make this concrete in your circumstance, but I'm hoping if we can't do that before, we'll definitely be able to do it, when we get together. And that's really the way to make progress.
Thank you. So I'm pausing because of the Zoom lag between ourselves here in Leicester and yourself over the Irish Sea there. But I think for our cohort of community leaders in Leicester, the people to the left and right are their colleagues on the program already. So
Mm.
as part of the program, one of the benefits of any leadership program, any learning program is always the network that you create. It's the people you meet, it's the relationships you build, and the opportunities that you find in those connections,
Yeah,
both from like-minded people and also the work that you're doing. And I think that looking left to right in this context will
mm,
be, this cohort already. We've
yes,
got such a fabulous range from football coaches to, people heading up music charities, homeless charities, women's domestic abuse charities, mental health, ex-offender programs. And yet they are the innovators in Leicester and Leicestershire
yeah,
in supporting the communities, because they're the ones, uh, doing the work and trying to push forward. So thank you. I think
mm,
that certainly helps us, knowing where to start and who to start partnering with.
yeah, yeah,
So next question then. Um, you've probably been in a position, I know you've been in a position where you've had formal authority in the roles that you've had, to be able to affect change, to be able to lead change with authority.
mm,
But what happens, or what would you draw on? Sorry, what would you draw on if you don't have that formal authority? You don't have a title, you don't have a salary, even. But let's not worry too much about the money at the moment. But obviously that is a concern. But more on the authority side of things. What would you draw on, and how would you lead if you haven't got that title, that formal authority?
mm. Well, the first thing to say, and this is, a great secret that nobody ever tells you, is that if you don't have authority, you look to the people you think have authority. And sometimes you think, if only I was in their position, look how much I could do. But actually, the people in that position, they don't seem to think they have authority either. Everybody seems to be looking for someone else's authority. So it's always somebody else that seems to be the person that has the authority that's required. Now, a lot of my time is spent with people who uh, you would expect to be people with a load of formal authority, huge organizations, global organizations, including household names that you'll have heard of, and other organizations and companies that, while you may never have used their products, you will have heard their name. And I work with the most senior people in those organizations, and they say the same thing. Even the chief executive says the same thing,
Okay.
because the chief executive will say, well, you see, the problem is there are these things called shareholders, and there are these things called analysts who work for the companies that invest money, and they hold shares in our company. And so I have to be answerable to them, and I have to meet with them regularly. And there's lots of things I would do if I could. So there's a story we tell ourselves there, which is interesting, but more useful is to do what I think all successful people do, which is to align yourself with someone else's authority. So the most powerful people in any organization are not the people at the top of the organization. They're the people who influence the people at the top of the organization. And some of those people are very, very junior indeed in terms of the hierarchy of an organization. And so let's think about, um, well, let's use a real example here that everyone will have some awareness of, if not actual familiarity. And then I'll maybe give an example from my own experience. So I'm imagining that everyone has now heard of a gentleman called Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings is by no means unique in the world, in British government, in any organization. Dominic Cummings is an advisor. He was the Prime Minister's lead advisor. I think that was his formal title. Okay. Um, and so mostly we don't hear about these people. Mostly we may not even know who they are. The idea that such a person didn't exist until Dominic Cummings, complete nonsense. These people have existed back as far, at least, as Machiavelli, who some people might be aware of, who wrote a book. A former Dominic Cummings post holder wrote a book about his work for a prime minister called Tony Blair called The New Machiavelli. So if I was going to be very blunt, I would say stop using your lack of authority as an excuse. Stop obsessing about looking for the authority figures and start finding out who are the people that influence the authority figures. So I'll give you now a real example of this from my own experience. I talked about working on violent crime in the Home Office. So technically that's for the Home Secretary. Home Secretary is the person who runs the Home Office. Although if you watch Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, you would get a very different view about who runs a government department. Okay, so there instantly there is, the limit of your authority as an elected official or politician. But there are now what are formerly known as special advisors, in the jargon, SPADs, SPAD, SPADs. So when I worked in the Home Office, and violent crime was a priority, so the Prime Minister was interested in it. That was Tony Blair at the time. The Home Secretary was very interested in it, therefore. That was David Blunkett initially, then Charles Clarke, then Joan Reid. And all of these people had special advisors. I got very little face time with any of the people I've mentioned, but I discovered that I could start to create a relationship with the special advisors in the Home Office. And then as I got to know more about who was who and who talked to who, I discovered that actually in Downing Street, or number 10, as you must call it, so learning the jargon is important, because if you say I'm going over to number 10, people think you know something. So you're already associating yourself with the authority of that building. If you say I'm going over to Downing Street, people know you don't know, because nobody in government calls Downing Street Downing Street. It's always number 10. So you need to learn the jargon, the lingo. Anyone can do this. I mean, I'm imagining that some of your people will be completely fluent in what I might call street lingo that I wouldn't have an idea about whatsoever. So you need to become multilingual. And if you want to make progress in a public system, you need to understand the lingo of the politicians, of the officers in the council, of the advisors, all those people. And so did this and eventually made a relationship with one of David Blunkett's special advisors. This is really, really powerful because I have no authority to speak to the Home Secretary about anything. I'm lucky if I get to speak to him directly at all. Mostly I have to write something that about 6 other people edit and change and decide to exclude and include and so on. But the special advisor starts every day by speaking to the Home Secretary and finishes every day by speaking to the Home Secretary and is expected to have 6, 10, 12 bright new shiny ideas every day. Well, it doesn't matter how creative or innovative or clever you are, quickly you're going to run out of useful ones. So what I'm saying there is find out how to be helpful to the people that advise the people in the authority that you need to associate yourself with. People in organizations do this all the time. And when I worked in government, a new cabinet secretary, that's the most senior civil servant in the United Kingdom. New cabinet secretary is appointed, and he was called Gus O'Donnell. He's now Lord O'Donnell. He became Sir Gus O'Donnell and then Lord O'Donnell. Um, and the the game that was played in Tony Blair's world was everyone used first names, which is very debilitating because David is quite a common name. David Blunkett, not so common, but David. So I would go to meetings and people would say David's interested in this or David's not interested in this, and I thought, well, that's why are you telling me this? Until you discover that when they say David, they mean Her Majesty's Secretary of State for the Home Office. Oh, well, that's a bit different. So shortly after Gus O'Donnell was appointed, a guy came to a meeting that I was at in the Home Office. And he kept saying he was late. And he said, I'm sorry I'm late, but I need to go and see Gus later. And then when he made a contribution, he said, I might have to leave early because I need to go and see Gus. What he was doing was saying to everyone in that meeting, although you may not know it, I am very important because I have a personal meeting with the new cabinet secretary. Now, whether he did or he didn't, none of us had any idea. But he was taking on the mantle of someone many levels above him in the system. People do this all the time. The sort of people that I always find really helpful are the secretaries, the PAs, the receptionists, the security staff, all of those people. They know a huge amount about what's going on. So, don't worry about not having formal authority. Find the people who advise the people or understand the people who have and start creating relationships with them. And then, to go back to my own example, if I can get the special advisor, the SPAD, to think that what I think's worth doing, he or she thinks worth doing, then they go and sell that to the person with authority. And then you just sit back and wait to be asked, which is very good. You're not knocking on the door now, you're being asked to come in and explain. Because when the advisor has agreed with the authority figure, we should do this, the special advisor or the PA or the secretary, whoever it is, has to then come back to you and say, we'd like to do that. Can you come and talk about it? So you're working around that, but everybody does that. And in fact, being outside the formal authority can be very helpful. When I was a police chief, I had a lot of authority, but also there were lots of things I couldn't do because of that. Going back to Dominic Cummings, if none of us had ever heard of Dominic Cummings, he could have driven to Barnard Castle every Thursday and we wouldn't have cared. But because he'd become out from behind the curtain, if you like, and had got a public persona, and remember, he is, but he was the first. I don't know how long the British government has been around, but Dominic Cummings is the first ever behind the scenes advisor to give a press conference in Downing Street. That's catastrophic from his perspective, which is why he's no longer in government. Advisors don't want to be seen. So there's a bit of work to be done in figuring out where they are, who they are, what they're interested in, what their problem is, and how you can be helpful with their problem. How much of an overlap can you create with what they want to accomplish and what you want to accomplish? And there's your space.
Thank you. That last, I think that last point is really crucial. You know, where's the overlap? You know, I mean, between, as you say, what they want to accomplish and what you want to accomplish. I
Yeah,
get that, and I've experienced that myself. Working in an organisation, one of my very first jobs years ago was I was a secretary, and so I learned very early on actually
yeah,
that this, we had quite a lot of power, and
yeah,
if nothing
sure,
else, over the diaries and who got what time
absolutely.
in the diaries. So and they knew exactly, just it who was who in an organisation, how to work, the systems and the processes, never mind the politics. So I certainly appreciate that from a personal perspective. If we take ourselves outside of an organisation at the moment and think, okay, so we've got to align ourselves to somebody else's authority, learn the jargon, and find an overlap between what we're interested in and what they're interested in. But we're not in an organisation. We're in the middle of a council estate,
Hmm.
a busy inner city road or whatever. And actually, it's it's not somebody else with formal authority or position. It might be somebody else with who's an influencer, has a reputation in the area, does have some power in running what goes on in the community. They could be. It could be a retailer. They could be, part of, I guess, some criminal activity. Does it work as well? Can you still align yourself to somebody else's authority if their authority again isn't formal?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about, criminal gangs, drug gangs, that's how it works. If you get yourself into trouble and owe a drug dealer a lot of money, it's not the relationship with the drug dealer that's your problem. It's your relationship with the person that runs that drug ring. But when the drug dealer shows up, they're showing up with the authority of that person. So what they're saying is, deal with me or it will be worse. Well, we're using that same pattern. It's the same pattern. We're aligning ourselves with other people's authority. We're calling on the authority of other people. I mean, very simple. You can do some very simple things. That example about the guy talking about Gus, so um, you, if you're at a community meeting and so let me give you an example of this. The world in which I have mainly worked, we have had very strong, cohesive communities. Now, that's something that people think is a good thing. Well, it depends what the purpose of that strong, cohesive community is. If that strong, cohesive community is assembled around a political ideal, let's say, of uniting Ireland and removing Northern Ireland from Britain, then we might think, well, that's okay. Everybody's entitled to have a view. They're entitled to make progress on their view politically. That's how our world works in this country. But they're not entitled to, use violence to do that. But then, like all of us, you might be a violent, what I would have called terrorist criminal, but you're also potentially, because most of these people are men, you're also a father. You might also be a partner or a husband. You might be a taxi driver. You might be someone who runs a local darts club. And so we have multi roles in our lives. None of us are single, identity creatures, which is one of the things that I guess is a risk to some of your people, that they become associated with a single topic, which sounds like a good thing. But if you take it too far, it means nobody else will be interested in that topic because their view will be, well, Sheila's dealing with that. I don't need to worry. But one of the community events that I was going to say blights Northern Ireland every summer, which shows what I think about it, is what are called community bonfires. So the label of a community bonfire sounds rather nice. You might think of it as like a May Day celebration in a leafy part of England. What it actually is the most foul, sectarian, vulgar display of community cohesion. And it's designed to upset the other. So it brings the community together by showing its opposition to another community. And it does that with a great deal of violence, apart from anything else, usually a great deal of alcohol and drugs as well. So that's a problem for the police. How do you police that? Well, if you follow the sort of normal standard rule book, you would put in a lot of police officers or security staff, a bit like you might do for a football stadium. But of course, if you do that, you're going to be considered to be provocative. You're likely to start the trouble rather than solve the trouble. And so, one of the things about these communities is that they are very well policed, not by the taxpayer funded professional police, but by the terrorist criminal gangs. So, whoever leads the terrorist gang in that estate is in charge of policing that estate. So, if you can align your interest with them, then to some degree you can hand over the policing of this community event to them. Now, of course, if that appears in the public, police chief hands over control of a state to terrorist gang leader. That's not good. But we do that sort of thing all the time. If we're organising a May Day parade, we will hand over quite a lot of the responsibility for policing that May Day parade to the May Day parade organiser. And so the question is, how much of that can you do? And sometimes when you're trying to do what you might call an informal deal like that, it's best done in public. So we actually did this in the town hall. So the phrase we use in Northern Ireland is even the dogs in the street know. But what that means is while the dogs in the street might know, no person knows formally. So at this town hall meeting, a gentleman who was described as a key influencer and a community leader in the community offered to work in partnership with the police to police this community event. Well, isn't that what community policing is all about? But of course,
Yeah.
everybody in the estate knows that this very warm, cuddly community leader who's working in collaboration with the police is also the guy who will have your legs broken if you misbehave. Now, should the police be involved in agreements like this? Well, not if it goes that far. But then, if we do the deal in public, we can make it very clear that as the police, we are willing to work in collaboration with you. We're very supportive of that. In fact, we warmly welcome this acceptance of responsibility, this enthusiasm to work collaboratively, this act of citizenship, all the sort of words. But then there comes a point at which, you know, as the police chief, you make very clear that if there is any criminal activity, if there is any violence, if there is any whatever it is, then, you know, be under no illusion that the police will take very severe action. And just in order that everybody's kept safe and secure and we all know what's happening, we will, of course, be using CCTV to record everything that happens in and around the area that evening. So, can you see the sort of relationship we're putting together there? This is what I call an
Yes,
on
I
the
can.
table and beneath the table deal. So, everybody knows what's going on, but they also know what's really going on. And in this example, as long as what's really going on never gets to become public, then we can make a lot of progress. You know. I talked about find a friend, find a freak. So this is a type of freak that you're working with there.
So could I just ask you maybe some clarifying points from what I've heard? If I'm a community leader and I'm taking your analogy and making it work in with the kind of issue that I'm trying to pursue or prevent, what you're saying is find those who are actively involved in whatever issue, whatever challenge, whatever problem it is that you're trying to make some progress on, align yourself to them, and with clear boundaries, have a conversation about how you can work together to pursue. I guess is this? Are you looking for some kind of win-win here? In our sense, it would be what can we do to police to prevent violence escalating, to prevent it affecting the young, um, prevent it affecting anybody, but in particular, bringing in young kids into gangs, and they don't need to be. So, this is, are you saying, let's find who's actively involved and bring them into the conversation and try and align yourself with them so that you can work together with these individuals in a sort of, this is what we're doing on the table and this is what we're doing beneath the table sort of approach?
Yeah, I'm not saying start there. You need to get to know people. This is all about relationships. You need to get to know people, and it's about boundaries, as you say. And I think increasingly, I think that how we raise children is a good model for this. But we seem to forget that there are stages to growth, and there are stages to stagnation, and there are stages to receding or retreating, whatever it is. Um, and then when we come to this sort of work, we expect to go from a community that's held siege by some deeply embedded drug fueled gang to next Monday morning, according to our carefully crafted project plan, it will be like the most amazing Disney-fied, state in the planet. Well, no, it won't. And it may never be Disney-fied, but it will be better. It's about being better. Maybe it's not even about being better. It's about being less worse before we start getting better. And so, you've got to deal with the people that are the problem. You can't work around them forever. You may not want to start like that, but you need to work towards that. I've been involved now for actually almost 20 years, it turns out. I had a message just a couple of days ago from a guy who had come across some film he had found of us on a peace building trip in South Africa in the wilderness in the bush. And this particular chap used to be a terrorist. And so you might think that, how would he and I have anything in common? And of course, both he and I started out thinking that. But over time, we discovered we had more in common than we had difference. And this is always the place to look. It seems to me that we always start by differentiating ourselves from somebody else. Well, I'm different to you. And sometimes the difference can be really marginal. You're wearing a sort of a blue top, and I'm wearing a sort of a I don't know what color this is. I was going to say purple, but it's not quite purple. But of course, both those colors, but both those are in the same spectrum on the color chart. It's not like, you're wearing white and I'm wearing black. And so look for similarities. And it might be that, there's some neutral ground of connection. I don't know, might be pool, might be snooker, might be soccer. It could be an interest in walking. I saw something recently where a Afro-Caribbean man started a walking group as a way of connecting Afro-Caribbean men in a circumstance. And the importance of getting out walking in the countryside if you live in a densely packed estate. That's why we went to South Africa for peace building. You have to get people out of their comfort zone. And so the great thing about taking people from Northern Ireland, from Belfast to the bush in South Africa, is everyone is equally vulnerable. And lions are not politically aware. A lion will eat anyone. They don't care if you're a victim or a perpetrator, if you're black or white, if you're Protestant or Catholic, if you're a good person or a bad person. Lions are not interested. Lions will eat anyone. And so it's this mutual vulnerability that enables a shift in the dynamics of relationship. You start to discover similarities. And then instead of being face to face opposing each other, you start to work side by side with each other.
Thank you. I think you might have answered my next question, which was, I'm sure you'll have more to say about it as well, but that was, what in your experience really drives change? You've certainly started on what can bond people, and, that word vulnerability, um, that mutual vulnerability almost, isn't it? That will help kickstart relationships and
Yeah.
kickstart pairs, couples, triads, groups of people to start working together. But if I can ask that question again, what in your experience really drives change in addition to that? Is there anything else that you've seen that really works? And I suppose I should clarify that I'm talking about behavioural change, attitude change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most important thing about change is it's moving away from where you are. So we put a lot of energy and effort into trying to have a vision for where we're going to get to, but nobody's going to get anywhere unless they move from where they are. So often in the corporate world, this is referred to as a burning platform. And the idea, and this is actually a real story. So the burning platform story comes from the North Sea oil industry, Piper Alpha, I think 1973. And the guy jumped from the burning platform and he survived. And he was asked, why did you jump? And it's the motivation here that's crucial. He said, I jumped because it was better to face possible death by jumping rather than to face certain death by not jumping. Now, I've done work in Aberdeen and I've been told that the person behind him didn't jump and did die. And so, you see, we like to think that we will volunteer to leave where we are to get to this Disney-fied better world. But actually, there's something okay about where we are, otherwise, we wouldn't be there. And very often, and I got this from working with people, because when I told this story, somebody said, "Oh, that's great. We have a burning platform in our organization." And I said, "Wonderful. How long have you had it for?" And they said, 18 months. Well, that's not a burning platform. That's what most of us have, which is a smoldering platform. And so we run around with, thicker shoes on and maybe with a fire extinguisher, and we put out these little flare ups. But actually, while we're doing that, we don't realize the legs on which the platform is stood are being burned away. And then the whole thing collapses. And so before that happens, better to do something about it. And so it's getting people to move from where they are. And this idea of a good crisis is what does that, or the felt sense of a crisis. So we spend a lot of time persuading people that our proclaimed destination will be brilliant. But if where they are is not bad enough for them, why would they take that risk? They understand how now works. They understand how this community works now. Yeah, okay, it may not be as good as it possibly could be theoretically, but actually, it's taken me a while to figure it out. Why would I suddenly rush towards something that only exists as a PowerPoint, as a slogan, as a document? Now, notice that's not the arc of change, but to get started, you need to move from where you are. And we often miss that point out. And the best way to get people to move is with an arm around their shoulder. It's not by poking in the chest. So it's back to that side by side rather than face to face. We think if we make our case face to face, people go, "Oh, yeah, I don't know why I never saw that before. Sure, of course, I'll give up, whatever it is, domestic violence right now, this evening. I'll never do another drug deal in my life. I mean, right now, I'm stopping immediately. It's not going to happen." So we got to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. The only way you get it to be anything close to what you'd like it to be, is to face the brutal facts of how it actually is and realize that for some people it's working. For most people, it must be working a bit or well enough, or they wouldn't be there. So that's really what drives change. It's not what keeps change moving, but it's what drives it. And getting into your car, starting it up and sitting there, hoping that at some stage, the destination you put into the sat nav will start happening. It won't. You got to put the car in gear, press the accelerator, let off the brake, and move. And that's the bit that I see a lot of people. They say we've got a plan, we've got a budget, we've run a workshop. We've got, yeah, sure. In my own experience, there was so much money, time, energy, effort put into what was called capacity building. So we're trying to get opposing communities to work with each other. And their story was, and of course this story is not unique to them, it turns out this is our most popular story for all of us. Their story is not that they're not willing to work with that other community. Their story is they're not yet able to work with that other community. And so we need capacity building. They're much better at us at putting forward their position. We would need to learn how to explain how we see things. They're much better at us than lobbying. When we meet people, we're not very good at lobbying, and so on and so on. You can fill in the blanks. The pattern's the same, fill in the blanks. And I'm not against this at all. But in this case, I have in my mind, this community had 5 years of capacity building, and they still apparently weren't able to literally cross the street and talk to the people on the other side of the street. And then I realized it's not a lack of ability that's holding them back, it's a lack of will. They weren't willing to do this. And the more we offered them capacity building, the more they didn't have to be willing. They just had to say, I need more, more resource. Is it always a good one? Need more resource. Well, if there's no will, it doesn't matter how much resource you give people. So some will needs to be found. And there's nothing like, to put it very bluntly, a burning flame in your backside to make you willing to move forward. So there comes a time when some way of using force, power, obligation, coming a little bit softer, encouragement is required sometimes to get people started. Lots of us know what it's like if we're trying to get ourselves fitter. In fact, the whole research and science around developing a habit is very clear. You need to do something 28 times before you have any chance of it becoming a habit. But if you don't do that for 7, so 28 days, I'm going to walk every day. If I walk for 28 days, I could say I'm a walker. But if I don't walk for 7 days, I'm right back at the start. And so just knowing some things, about how we work, and maybe, in your group of innovators and leaders, just having that conversation about their own personal experience. It doesn't have to necessarily be about the project, because the pattern of what stops you becoming a walker, becoming a reader, becoming a dancer, becoming whatever it is, that pattern is the same pattern that stops people from stopping abusing kids, their partners, stop them, engaging in drug dealing and littering and I don't know, whatever the various things are that people are animated about. And the energy comes from what I now call a righteous rage. It took me a long time to realize this about myself, because everybody says you need a vision. And I never felt I was visionary or had a vision. But then I realized I used to have to make them up and hope that they would sound, like it was something I was important or cared about. And to some extent it did. But what I realized was I cared more about where we were now and trying to move from where we are now, what I now call a righteous rage. So what this means is I've noticed this is happening here. I've noticed this has been happening here in my community, in our organization, in my team for days, weeks, months, years. And I don't know about you, but I'm not happy about it. I'm not comfortable about it. In fact, if I'm not careful, I can get quite angry about it quite quickly. Um, I'll make this concrete with the example of female genital mutilation. Now, I don't know a lot about this, but I do know that in some council areas, some social workers, some medics, some taxpayer funded professionals told themselves and others a story that this was how a certain type of community behaved culturally. It was a bit like, getting your ears pierced when you were, whatever, 14, 16, 18, I don't know. These days it's probably when you're 8 or something, right? Well, no, it's not, because getting your ears pierced is not against the law in this country, whereas female genital mutilation is the most vicious and horrible assault on a child. And clearly, in this democratic country in which we all live, that is a crime, and certainly not one that taxpayer funded public servants should be facilitating, encouraging. So that's the sort of story that I want to think about starting. I want to think about, your people starting. And then there's a pause. There's a pause while people wonder, are you serious about this? Because they've heard all sorts of people say things like this before in various levels of commitment or strength. Are you serious? So then you got to need to do something to demonstrate you're serious. Not everything, just something. And then little by little, people will start to appear. Maybe it's the people on the program. Maybe the people sat next to you in the virtual Zoom room will message you directly offline and go, do you know, I heard you talking about female genital mutilation there. And you seem quite angry about it. Actually, I'd never thought about it, but now I've stopped to think about it. I'm actually quite angry too, because I actually have daughters. And the idea that anyone would do that to my daughters, or even worse, that any doctor, maybe a doctor that I actually have been to see, would facilitate or do that, that really infuriates me too. So now there's two of us, and then we each go and find somebody else, and then there's four of us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Um, I've been making a few notes, and I'm just going to bring it all together, if I may,
Yeah.
just to close our conversation today. So what I've taken away from our conversations this morning is to start connecting with other people who are besides you, so other innovators, other early adopters, other people that are doing work that is similar to yours, doesn't have to be the same, but reach out and connect. And align yourself with other people's authority, whichever world that they are in, whether that be the police, the local council, voluntary organisations, or the communities themselves, those individuals who have authority or perceived authority with the group, the community group that you're working with. Learn the jargon, so learn so that you can talk the talk along with them, and collaborate with those who are actually involved in whatever it is, the problem, the issue, the challenge. So this is when you were talking about collaborating with perhaps the other criminals, or community leaders who are leading in a sense, but they might not be on the right side of the law, but they're respected in that community. Look for what you've got in common with those people. And that might be something social, it might be family, it might be other friends, who knows, and try and hook up on sort of mutual vulnerability. I know you talked about that, getting people out of their comfort zone to help build those relationships. And then finally, you've started talking to us about the crisis, finding that thing that you've got that righteous rage about, talking about it and defining the crisis, so that those who are living their lives and are comfortable and yeah, I think comfortable and used to living in that system the way that it is, they know it, they understand it, will find hopefully some alignment with whatever it is that you're really angry about. It will help, you know, that they can be really angry about, and that could be the sort of lever that helps them into aligning with whatever movement it is you're trying to create. So hopefully, I've picked up most of the points that you've shared with us today. Um, do correct me if I've been wrong in any of those. I know you're going to share more with us when we meet with the group in a couple of weeks' time. I just wanted to, you know, finish by saying thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Debbie. Thank you. And I look forward to working with you and with the people on the program in the not too distant future. So thanks very much indeed.